All right, for those of you that watch, I hope I'm recording my voice. Anyway, so Nehemiah, I got you all a handout. We'll go over the handouts first to kind of get a background on the. You got one. Background on the book. If you want, grab the first one that's got the kind of the highlighted portion at the top, not the one that says copied from, but just the other. I won't read this verbatim, but I just kind of want to hit some of the highlights just so we have an understanding of what we're talking about here. Now, Nehemiah is the second to last book of the Old Testament. Malachi is written in the same time frame, perhaps after Nehemiah, but it's in that same time frame. So to kind of give you a context that, it's not going to be much longer after the book of Nehemiah that we have no books of Scripture written until Matthew comes on the scene. So, or John the Baptist, I'll say, that's recorded in the New Testament. So, but this happens in roughly 445 BC to 430 BC. Now, this takes place about 14 years or so after Ezra had left Babylon and went to Jerusalem. So, at this time, Ezra is still alive and is in Jerusalem. But this is from Nehemiah's perspective and the things that Nehemiah does. He is a cupbearer to the king in Persia or Shushan, and he's been born and raised in Persia, never been to Jerusalem, never been to Judah, never been to Israel. He's lived all of his life under the Babylonian captivity and then under the Persian Empire, and he is now serving the king of Persia at Shushan. So Nehemiah is one of the Jews that has been like Esther and like Daniel and like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these ones that were Jews that had been raised into some type of prominence within these foreign governments. And we see here that Nehemiah is one as well. So this is, let's see here, going through. So Ezra went back to Jerusalem to help rebuild the temple. If you remember, they began the temple under Zerubbabel. They quit for a while. Ezra went back several years later and finished the temple at that time. Nehemiah's role here is to go to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls. And we'll talk about that as we go through the book, but that is Nehemiah's role in Scripture, is he is going to go to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls around the city. Again, more on that as we go. It did only take 52 days to rebuild the walls. Interesting to think that they went perhaps a century without even rebuilding the walls because of such with as quickly as they were able to rebuild them. Why did they not do that? And again, we'll talk about that as we go through the Scriptures. Now, this other one, the one that says copied from Enduring Word, this other page, this is kind of just an overview of the first chapter here, but and kind of touches on some of the same things that I just discussed. But understand that Nehemiah has never been to Israel, never been to Judah, never been to Jerusalem, but he has this tremendous burden for the city of God and God's people. And again, we'll talk about that as we go. So any comments or questions before we actually do get started? Nehemiah chapter 1. Now, the king at this time is Artaxerxes. He would be the son of the king that was king during Esther's time. So this would be perhaps 20 years after Esther's time as queen. So we do have a different king now. All right. Anybody got anything? Nope. Okay. Make sure I got all my notes here. Actually, Nehemiah chapter 1 through 12 takes only about a year's time frame. And then there's a 20-year gap between chapter 12 and chapter 13. And again, we'll talk about that as we go along through the book. But the first 12 chapters covers about 1 year. And again, understand, it only takes 52 days to do the work that Nehemiah sets out to do, which is what, a month and a half, 2 months. And it takes him 4 months to get from Shushan to Jerusalem. So a lot of this time frame was the preparation and the travel to Jerusalem. And once he gets to Jerusalem, it only takes him a month and a half to get the work done. But again, more on that as we go. Trying to lay a foundation here. I guess that's about it. And so again, the time frame is 445 or 444 BC in that time frame. We will see in chapter 1, verse 1, that it's in the month Chislev, which is November, December time frame, for context. And then he talks to the king. I think it's in March and April, which we'll see as we go. So anyway, we are going to do chapter 1 today, so we should be done quickly today. I'm going to preach, and that being said, there was a lot that if we finished chapter 1 early, wouldn't have had enough time to do chapter 2, so we're just going to do chapter 1 today. So you'll get out of class early today. How's that? Nobody ever complains about getting out of class early. Of course, I don't know anybody complains about getting out of class late. I don't know. Maybe under your breath you do. So anyway, Nehemiah chapter 1, we'll begin in verse 1. That's a good place to start.
The book of Nehemiah.
There we go.
Chapter 1. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. And it came to pass in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan, the palace, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came, he and certain men of Judah, and asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said unto me, the remnant that are left of the captivity, there in the province, are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire.
So now all of this happened, the gates falling, the walls being burned, the cities being ravaged, happened under Babylon in 605, and in the following years after 605, when the Babylonians came in and overtook Jerusalem. So this city has been in somewhat of a shambles for 150 years or so. And so, again, it only took 52 days to rebuild the wall. So it's not you would think that soon after getting there, they would rebuild the wall, but again, we see 150 years or so that they didn't do that. Now, in those days, an unfortified city or an unwalled city was kind of a backwater town because you really couldn't, there wasn't a police force, and so you couldn't necessarily keep marauders out or somebody that would come in and be a thief with no walls and with really no protection. So with that being said, the temple, while it was in use, active use, and the sacrifices were going on and the worship was going on, the temple was not ordained or ornate like it was under Solomon's time because there was no walls to protect it. There was nothing that would keep a band of men to go in and take all of the things that were worth anything. And so, while yes, the temple was rebuilt and the worship was reinstituted and all these Jewish traditions, so to speak, it wasn't nearly like it was during Solomon's time for a number of reasons, but one of, they didn't have any way to protect the precious metals and the precious instruments that were in the tabernacle. And it says there in verse 2, he asks his brother, Hanani, what's it like back there? How are they doing? And he says, the remnant that are left of the captivity in the province are in great affliction and reproach. Now, perhaps that's because without any walls, there was always this constant threat of people coming and taking what was useful or worth stuff. And so, can you imagine living in a city? I think of it this way: living in a city that's got rampant crime, and you have no way of locking your doors or your windows, or you're living in somewhere that's unfortified, and knowing that all this crime is going on around you, and you have no way of locking your stuff or keeping yourself safe, you wouldn't sleep very well. You certainly wouldn't want to accumulate much wealth or anything of any value. And in much the same way, these people of Jerusalem are living in that type of lifestyle. They're just on edge of any kind of threat, especially remembering what happened when Babylon came in and took them captive and burnt the city, again, some 150 years prior. So they're not living at peace and safety and happiness, even though they're allowed to be back in their home country, even though they're allowed to go to their temple, even though they're allowed to do the service of the Lord in their home country. There's still this threat of theft and harm because the city is unwalled. All right? And it says there, Hananiah tells Nehemiah in verse 3, the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Again, that's been for 150 years. The city is a shambles. So, verse 4.
And it came to pass when I heard these words that I sat down and wept, and mourned certain days, and fasted, and prayed before the God of heaven, and said, I beseech thee, O Lord God of heaven, the great and terrible God, that keepeth covenant and mercy for them that love him, and observe his commandments, let thine ear now be attentive, and thine eyes open, that thou mayest hear the prayer of thy servant, which I pray before thee now, day and night, for the children of Israel thy servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against thee. Both I and my father's house have sinned. We have dealt very corruptly against thee, and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the judgments which thou commandest thy servant Moses.
So we see Nehemiah deeply moved by the word that he gets. Now, I want to remind you, once again, Nehemiah has never been to Jerusalem. He's never been to Israel. He's never been to Judah. He's lived essentially his whole life in Babylon or Persia. Perhaps he's lived his whole life in Shushan, which is the capital at this time. We don't really know. But he has a heart that is broken for his people some 800 miles away. Perhaps there's not anybody there that he even knows. But he knows that those people that live there and are serving the Lord there, or at least worshiping at the temple there, and they're heartbroken, they're distressed, they're under persecution, and they're not living a happy, free life because the walls are torn down. But he has this longing for the people of Jerusalem, people he doesn't know, other than that they are family, they are Jews, people he's never probably ever seen. Perhaps maybe he does, but generally speaking, he doesn't know those people. Notice how he prays here. He fasted and he prayed and he mourned, verse 4, and he petitions the Lord. O Lord God of heaven, the great and terrible God that keeps covenant and mercy for them that love him and observe his commandments. God had made a promise and a covenant with Israel that if they serve him, he will keep them. And we've seen his hand over them time and time and time again. Even amongst the captivity, God kept his promise. You're going to be under captivity to the Babylons for 70 years. After 70 years, I'm going to allow you to come back. And we studied through Daniel and Ezra and Esther. All of those things happened. So not only did Nehemiah know the promises of God, but he is reminding God, you made this promise, God. If there's anybody there that is serving you, you promised to keep them. It's kind of like, growing up, you tell your kids that we'll do whatever it is. Go to McDonald's. And that time comes, and they say, now, Daddy, you remember, you promised. Well, I remember. I promised, yes. I remember that I'm going to take you to McDonald's. You don't need to remind me, but the hope of a child reminding their dad, you promised. That's kind of the way it is here with Nehemiah. God, I know you know, but you made a promise to your people that you would protect them and that you would restore them. So again, it's not like God has forgotten, but Nehemiah is pointing out the fact that, God, you did promise. But notice what he says there in verse 6. Let thine ear now be attentive and thine eyes open. Hear what I'm asking and see what is happening. Now again, God knows all things, but Nehemiah is acknowledging to God that you are the one that can do what needs to be done here in Jerusalem. And it says here in verse 6 as well, I pray before thee now day and night for the children of Israel, thy servants. I confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against. He's not saying, well, those people over there are lazy bums. They haven't even tried to rebuild the temple, or the walls. They haven't tried to do anything, God. Look at them over there. Nehemiah is including himself in with these people. We have sinned. We have sinned. It's my fault as well as their fault. He's not pointing out the weaknesses of the others. He's including himself in the whole of the people, that we have let down you and we have let down the city. It says there in verse 7, we have dealt very corruptly against thee. You know, we do that every week. I say every day. We, at times, shake our fist at God and say, I'm going to do it my way. And that was Israel's mantra. They go off and do what they want to do against God's covenant and against God's commands. They go off and do what they want, but yet God is merciful. But we've dealt corruptly against thee. We have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the judgments, which you have commanded thy servant Moses. Now, understand too, I feel like I'm rattling on here. Understand too that the law of Moses was given to Moses some 1,000 years prior to this book of Nehemiah. But the words of Moses, or the law of Moses, has been handed down throughout the centuries to where even Nehemiah here, far away from Jerusalem, far away from Judah, far away from Israel, he knows the law of Moses. He knows that God has kept and made promises to Israel. So this handing of down, or this passing down of the laws of God and the statutes of God and the promises of God, even though they're in a faraway country under foreign leadership, they still know, generally speaking, the laws of God and the promises of God. And that's important for us as parents and grandparents and all, to pass down the things that we know of the Lord to our heritage. Because they may not be somewhere where they have a Bible or whatnot, just saying. But understand the importance of, and where do you think the wise men at Jesus' birth came? From the east, from Persia. Well, how did they know? Because of the influence of the Jews that were living there some 400 years prior to them coming and seeing the Christ child. So this spread of Judaism, or I will say Christianity, happened more or less because of the captivity of the Jews by Babylon. And so the message of the Lord and the promises of God has been handed down through centuries from the people of God. And it goes on today. How do people hear about the promises of God and the commands of God? By Christians going out and telling people. Anyway, diatribe over. Anybody got any questions or comments? You know, we went through 7 verses, but there's a lot in these 7 verses, and we only got 3 or 4 more. But I want us to get this context of the heart that Nehemiah has for God's city, Jerusalem. Verse 8. Yeah, we're going to be done pretty quick here.
Remember, I beseech thee, the word that thou commandest thy servant Moses, saying, if ye transgress, I will scatter you abroad among the nations. But
and God did tell Moses that, if you sin against me, you will be scattered amongst the nations. And that happened. Israel was taken over by Assyria in 7-something BC. And Judah and Benjamin were taken over by the Babylonians in 605 and following years. And they were scattered among the people because they broke the commandments of God. And that's what Nehemiah is reminding the Lord here. You did tell us that if we transgress, that we're going to be scattered. But, verse 9, the first word of that is but. Look at verse 9.
If ye turn unto me, and keep my commandments, and do them, though there were of you cast out unto the uttermost part of the heaven, yet will I gather them from thence, and will bring them unto the place that I have chosen to set my name there.
So when they were taken to Babylon, they were scattered amongst the empire of Babylon. But when the Persians took over under Cyrus, those that were scattered amongst Babylon were allowed to return back to Judah some 70 years after the fact. Now, not all of them went. We've read that through Ezra, that not all of them that were in Babylon had went back to Judah. And really, in comparison, there was just a small group that did go back. But nevertheless, God promised that I will allow you to come back, and some did, but the offer was there for any of them to return back. So even though they were scattered, the opportunity was there for them to go back. Now, I'm not at all suggesting that the people that did not go back to Jerusalem were in some kind of sin or rebellion against God. I don't think that at all. Perhaps some of them were, but generally speaking, I don't think that those that stayed in Babylon and then Persia were in sin. But God made a promise that he would bring them back to their country, and that was fulfilled, again, 70 years after they were first taken captive. An amazing picture in Scripture of how God keeps to perfection. 70 years, and there they are. They're back. They're allowed to go back. So Nehemiah is reminding God that, yes, we know that you allowed us to go back. You made us this promise. And God has set his name in Jerusalem. Why do you think that it's the center of world politics and world whatever? Jerusalem, because that's the city of God. It's a divided city. It won't be one of these days. Stay for church and I'll talk about that. Anyway, verse 10.
Now these are thy servants and thy people, whom thou hast redeemed by thy great power, and by thy strong hand. O Lord, I beseech thee, let now thine ear be attentive to the prayer of thy servant, and to the prayer of thy servants, who desire to fear thy name and prosper. I pray thee, thy servant this day, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer.
So again, this petition to God, hear our prayers, be attentive to what we're asking. And in Nehemiah's case, he's going to want to go back to rebuild the walls. He's not praying for somebody else to go do it. He's not praying that those lazy bums in Jerusalem get busy and do it. He's praying that it just be done. And again, as we'll find out through the rest of the book, that Nehemiah is the one that goes back and actually leads up that charge to do that. And then it's odd at the end of verse 11, he just decides to put in there verse 11, I'm the king's cupbearer. So Nehemiah does have some influence with the king, because to be the king's cupbearer would mean that he is a very trusted man. He's the one that samples the king's food and drink before the king eats it. That'd be a tough job. You think about that. Somebody wants to kill the king, well, especially if it was something delayed, oh, that tastes good to me, and then 4 hours later we're all dead. I don't know. I kind of thought about that this week, as how would that all work, but maybe I need a cupbearer.
So you do.
Yeah.
I mean, you do the cooking.
Yeah,
so
I do the cooking. That'd be backward.
What you're gonna save yourself.
Maybe you need a cupbearer.
Yeah.
Anyway. But do we see here the heart of Nehemiah here? He longs for the walls to be repaired in a city he's never been to. But in some ways, perhaps, I likened it this way, and you can take it how you want. Perhaps you've been away from this church for decades, and you hear that the place burned down. Perhaps in some way, your heart would long for this place to be rebuilt because you've been here and you've experienced this place. That would be normal for us if we lived far away and hadn't been here for years, to want New Hebron to be rebuilt. But to have never been to New Hebron, to have never seen New Hebron, to have never been involved in anything here, but to hear from 800 miles away, a church that you probably have heard of but didn't know anything about, oh, they burned, okay. But again, Nehemiah here wants to go back and help them. So I kind of wonder, where our hearts could be sometimes. I think, well, that's sad for them. But understand that Nehemiah understands the importance of Jerusalem, Judah, Israel. He understands the importance that all represents to the people of God and to God, because again, this is the city of God. So anyway, with that might be the quickest Sunday school lesson I've ever given. Anybody got any comments or questions?
Why do you think they haven't done it themselves?
Okay, let's go to Ezra chapter 4. Maybe? Yeah, that's Ezra chapter 4. Now, if we remember our study of Ezra, Ezra went back with carte blanche from the king to do what he needed to do to get the temple rebuilt. And if you remember, prior to that, Zerubbabel was given basically carte blanche from the king Cyrus to rebuild the temple and to go back. Now there was, if you remember, that when Zerubbabel began, there was heavy opposition to Zerubbabel and his men rebuilding the temple. And that's kind of spelled out in chapter 4 of Ezra. And the work of rebuilding the temple was then ceased because of the opposition that was against them. And that work stopped for some 15 years or so. And then Ezra, let's see, Ezra chapter, okay, yeah, Ezra chapter 4, chapter 5, and chapter 6 is the opposition to the rebuilding. Chapter 5, they do begin again to rebuild the temple somewhat, but kind of half-heartedly. Chapter 6 is them going again all in and rebuilding the temple. Okay, everybody understand that? And the temple's rededicated. But I think that I'm answering Cynthia's question in a long way. I think at that point, all the opposition that was against them in rebuilding the temple maybe perhaps took the wind out of their sails. Perhaps also those that were against them rebuilding the temple were also opposing any type of rebuilding of the walls, because then, again, Jerusalem would become a fortified city. And so, while I can't say for certain that that's why that they decided to not rebuild the walls, I think they were just perhaps tired. A new generation had came in that didn't know that the walls had what it once stood for. I'm guessing, even though the walls you could tell were burned and knocked down. And so there's this period of hard labor to get the temple reestablished perhaps led them to then just be apathetic to getting the rest of the work done because of the opposition against rebuilding the temple that was overcome. Don't misunderstand, they did rebuild it, but it took them 20 some odd years to rebuild the temple. And it's kind of like when you build a house and for whatever reason you move in before it's all done, and then you live there 10 years and you still have 2 wall plates that aren't hung and baseboard in the bathroom that's never been. Does everybody know what I'm talking about? Yeah.
We finished our house 30 years later.
It's that's what I look at it as. Oh, well, we got the main part of it done, the temple, so why build the walls? But again, the baseboard in the bathroom will take you a day. Just do it. And kind of the same way with the walls. It's going to take you a month or 2 to do it. Just get busy and do it. But yeah. And perhaps by the time the temple was redone, they didn't have carte blanche to rebuild the walls. They were only told to rebuild the temple. So perhaps that's another reason why they didn't rebuild the walls. Because the blessing of the king was to rebuild the temple. Just something to think about. But I don't know 100% sure. So anyway. Well, good. That extended our class just a little bit. So anyway. Well, with that, we will close. Let me see if I can...